Welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our sponsors, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Today, we are joined by Professor Eric Rath, who will be presenting on the story of sushi, how a fermented dish became a global fast food. Professor Eric Rath is a professor of history at the University of Kansas, where he teaches courses on food history and pre-modern Japan. A specialist in traditional Japanese foodways, his books include Food and Fantasy in Early Modern Japan, Japan's Cuisines, Food, Place, and Identity, and Oishii, The History of Sushi. He is a member of the editorial collective of Gastronomica, the Journal of Food Studies, and he is currently completing a history of sake. Professor Rath, it is a pleasure to have you with us here today. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Amani. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. There we go. I assume people can see that. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be joining you from Kansas. If you're in Japan, it's morning there, and I'm happy to talk about sushi. The story of sushi, how a fermented dish became a global fast food. There we go. So what I want to talk about today is recognize the fact that's probably evident to most of you, to all of you, I would say, that sushi is a global dish. I was traveling in rural China in a place with dirt roads, and there was a place that sold sushi. I couldn't believe it. So it's everywhere almost. We're going to recognize that fact and then offer a definition of sushi. We know it when we see it, but what is it? What does sushi mean? I'll offer one definition. And then talk about the history of sushi. And that's really the focus of my book, is that history of sushi. And today I'm going to give you the executive summary of that. And that boils down to one thing: making sushi faster. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. I'm a historian, but I'm going to offer some thoughts about the future of sushi, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. I'll be speaking about 35 minutes, and so we'll have plenty of time for questions. And I understand you can put those questions in the chat too, and we can look at them later. Okay. Well, global age of sushi. This hit me when I came back from Japan around 1998, 1997. I was living in Kyoto, and of course, in Japan, sushi is everywhere. You go to the convenience store, you go to takeout places, you go to very nice sushi restaurants, and it's ubiquitous. I was moving back to the States in the 90s, and wow, suddenly sushi was everywhere there too. Not just the sushi restaurants that I was familiar with, but also places like supermarkets had sushi, and the University of Kansas, the food court has sushi. So sushi is really very much part of our daily life. Pick it up almost without thinking about where it came from. And of course, there's all sorts of varieties of sushi. Can't even list them all in the program tonight. But many of you are familiar with sushi rolls. I'm sure that seems to be one of the most popular varieties today. And here's a nice example from a restaurant that's in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and also in the Chicago area, Slurping Turtle. Their red dragon roll with tempura, tuna, avocado, red and wasabi tobiko, spicy mayo, and eel sauce. It's typical now to see a lot of these rolls with different sauces on it. And I hope you take this opportunity to eat something while you're listening to me, because I think a topic like this can make you very hungry. At least it does in my case. One of the things I did for my research was to polish off that sushi bento, sushi box lunch. I got it in a train station in Japan. That's in the top right corner. And oh wow, you see sushi rolls right in the front, and then there's inari sushi, this very thin layer of sweet tofu packed with rice. More sushi rolls, and then in the back we have hidden almost these Osaka-style pressed sushi. All very good, all probably meant for more than one person, all consumed by yours truly on the train one day in Japan. I'm often asked what my favorite kind of sushi is. And I'm going to introduce this type to you right now. It's called tekone sushi or pirate sushi. And the story is that pirates, probably not pirates, but fishermen would go out and whatever they caught, they would slice it up like sashimi and then serve it on top of rice. And I enjoyed that uh, in a restaurant in Mie. It was quite a pleasure. And it just was wonderful overlooking the waters and eating that tekone pirate sushi. But what is sushi? We've been talking about it. We know it when we see it. What does it mean? Well, this is a question that perplexed people in the 17th century Japan. In the 17th and 18th century, there are many scholars of the language, and they're trying to understand the roots for Japanese language. And one of them came up with the idea that the word sushi referred to something sour, because in Japanese there's a word sui, meaning sour. And I think this really works well, because if we look at this character for sour, there's several meanings we can unpack from it. First of all, there's a meaning that it could be vinegar. The character that's usually used for vinegar is the one in parentheses there, but sometimes you see this as vinegar. So there's a sourness from vinegar, right? That's one kind of sourness. Well, another way that this character can be read is as san. And that's a different kind of sourness. That's the sourness of something very, very acidic, sharp tasting. It's the sourness of yogurt. So we have on the one hand, the sourness of vinegar, and then the other hand, this sourness of yogurt. And that actually works really well for understanding the different types of sushi out there. Because on the one hand, we have the sushi that we know today. That's sushi made with rice flavored with vinegar. And usually they put in some salt, and these days they put in sugar too. But there's a sort of sourness to that that we're familiar with when we're eating sushi rolls or the pressed nigiri sushi here. But there's another type of sourness too. There's that sourness of san, that acidic sourness. And that comes from a much older type of sushi that's been fermented through lactic acid fermentation. And lactic acid fermentation is the kind of fermentation that's used for yogurt. And what happens is proteins, they break down into tasty amino acids, and it takes quite a long time to produce this type of sushi. And this is a type of sushi you don't see very much in Japan these days at all. It exists as a traditional food in certain regions. In fact, I would go so far as to say is if this type of sushi that's on the right was the only type of sushi in Japan today, we wouldn't be having this conversation because it's got a very, very distinct taste. And I'm going to talk about that. Looking back for the history of sushi now, we can go back to China. And we can go back to some dictionaries that were written in the 3rd century BCE. And we find the character for sushi, pronounced as ji. And what does that mean? Well, according to the dictionary, it's a dish made of fish and salt. Unfortunately, that's the only directions we have. So some sort of salted fish dish. Well, around the 3rd century Common Era, another character debuts, and that's ja. And that is fish, salt, and grain. So it's almost the same thing as the earlier character, meaning just fish and salt. And people quickly use the characters interchangeably. So by the 4th century, this ji or ja referred to some dish made with fish, salt, and grain. Unfortunately, we don't have any of these ancient recipes. We just have this description, very short. So we wonder what this dish might have been. Well, another text can tell us, and that's a really important document called The Important Arts for the People's Welfare, the Chimin Yaoshi, which is a 6th century text that has all kinds of recipes in it, including recipes for sushi. And actually, the recipe in this text is very, very long. So I'm just going to give you the executive summary of it. And this is the first sushi recipe that we know of, 6th century China. How do you make sushi according to these directions? First of all, you catch some carp, then you clean the carp and you gut them, and then you salt them. And you put them in a container and let them sit for a while. Usually at this point, after a while, you take them out of the container, you wash them, get rid of some of the salt. The salt helps dry out the fish. Well, you resalt them, and then you add rice or millet to the container. And then you add some flavorings, which is kind of interesting because when we think of sake made today, sushi made today, it doesn't really involve sake, but this 6th century recipe had sake. They had flavorings like orange peel. So imagine all this stuff, the fish that's been salted, the carp, some kind of grain, rice or millet, flavored with sake, orange peel, other things, and then it's packed into a bucket, and then you wait. How long do you wait? Well, months, maybe years. And this is when the process of lactic acid fermentation takes place. The proteins break down, they become tasty amino acids, and the flavor of the fish completely changes, and of the grain that's packed in there with it. It's really remarkable. How do they eat it? Well, not raw. The recipes that we can look at in this text, the important arts for the people's welfare, show sushi being added to soups and savory foods. So it's kind of like a little flavor enhancer, if you will, in the period. Well, moving on to Japan. Here we have the first records of sushi appearing in the 8th century. And it appears in documents like this one. It's really not even a document. It's a wooden tag called a mokan. And these were used to transport goods. It's kind of like if you go to the airport and you get a baggage tag, and the baggage tag will tell people where these things are going and who they belong to. Well, mokan did the same thing. They also would include some short description about what was inside. So we have these mokan indicating that there's sushi that's being sent from the provinces to the imperial court in Nara. We have carp sushi, abalone sushi, ayu or sweet fish sushi, and then surprisingly, we have sushi made of animals, deer sushi, boar sushi. So quite a wide variety of sushi. Unfortunately, though, there's no recipes. So we kind of have to guess what this ancient type of sushi was like, but it was probably similar to the sushi made in China with lactic acid fermentation. We can try something similar to that today, and I'll go into it in just a second. But want to give you now the executive summary of what the history of sushi was. Ancient sushi, fermented lactic acid fermented sushi, that was produced over a period of months to years. In the medieval period, 13th, 14th century, people got tired of waiting. And we have this new term emerge of a fresh matured sushi. In other words, people didn't want to wait weeks and years and months. They made this in weeks. Fast forward to the 17th century, and then all these recipes for fast sushi debut. And fast sushi is made in a matter of days. That's what people back in the 17th century meant by fast. Of course, today, if we think about sushi, the best sushi is when we go to the sushi bar, we sit and talk with the sushi chef, and they make the sushi right in front of us. So it's immediately made for us. In other words, we can talk about the history of sushi as a process of speeding up the process of making sushi. Now I'm going to talk about these various types of sushi. First of all, this ancient type. And like I said, we don't have recipes from the 8th century, but we have something that's probably similar to it. And it's this type of sushi called funazushi that comes from Shiga Prefecture. And it's made in other parts of Japan too. This is quite remarkable. If you ever have a chance to go to Shiga, please do try this. Um, it's a fermented sushi, fermented with lactic acid fermentation. And what happens is fishermen who are fishing in this lake in March and April, they catch all these funa. And funa is a type of carp. It's about the size of your hand, and it's similar to a goldfish. So they're not very big at all. They catch these fish in March or April. They do that when they're spawning, and then they salt them. They clean them, and they salt them, and they put them aside until about August or September. And in August or September, they pack them in a barrel with rice and with more salt, and then they leave it. And they leave it for a period of months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, and the whole flavor of the fish changes. It ferments. It preserves the fish, but it completely changes the fish's flavor profile. Depending on how you slice this fish, it tastes like prosciutto if it's sliced very thinly. If you slice it kind of thick, it tastes like summer sausage. So the taste of the fish is completely changed. The rice becomes incredibly sour. As a matter of fact, it's probably one of the most sour things I've ever eaten in my life is this rice. It reminded me of these hard candies I had once when I was a kid. My friend said I didn't like it, but I had to try it. I put it in my mouth and I almost spit it out. That's similar to this rice because it just becomes completely sour. Some people don't eat it. They'll eat the fish, but not the rice. And some people will use the rice for other things. So this is a type of sushi that still exists in Japan today. It takes 6 months, at least a year to make. It might take you 2 or 3 years to get a really good funazushi. That's the ancient type. Well, there are modern versions of the medieval type. And the medieval type of sushi is called namanare. And what that means is something that's called fresh, matured sushi. And basically, what this boils down to is rather than waiting for 6 months to a year or two to eat your sushi, here you only 8 weeks. So the flavor profile is very different. If funazushi, the one back here, the one back here tastes incredibly sour and tastes like meat or sausage, then this namanare, if you taste the cheese, it tastes like cheddar cheese. So it's started to ferment, but it hasn't quite gone there yet. And the fish too has a sort of cheddary taste to it, and it's quite good. By the way, you only want to eat a little bit of one of these fish. I was studying the history of sushi in Japan, and I made it a point to eat funazushi every day for 3 days in a row. And don't ever do that, anybody out there. It's a bit too much. A little bit is very good. A lot is overkill. Moving on now to the early modern period, and finally we have the sushi that we know today. We have sushi rolls, rice and ingredients that have been rolled up in nori seaweed that dates from the late 1700s. And then early 19th century, nigiri sushi makes its debut in Edo, now Tokyo. How did they speed up the recipe? Well, this is when they started adding things to the rice to get that sour taste without the weight. So initially they tried adding sake. They tried adding the leftover rice from sake brewing, the sake kasu. Sometimes they added koji, but what worked the best and was easiest was vinegar. So just a little splash of vinegar into the rice, and there you go. You have your sushi. It's now a street food. You can eat standing up outside, order some sushi, and you're good to go. Kind of like you would order a hot dog in the United States. As a matter of fact, the size of this Edo period, the early modern sushi or early 20th century sushi was about the size of a hot dog. It was about 2 to 3 times the size of your typical nigiri sushi that we get today. So quite different, much larger. Rice was also much saltier and less sweet because people didn't add sugar to it. How do we know this? Well, we have this wonderful sushi cookbook, dates from 1910 by Koizumi Seizaburo, who traced his family line to the person who helped popularize nigiri sushi in the early 19th century. So you can look at these recipes and see how it was made back then. It's quite different from the way it was today. It's much bigger. Sushi evolves over the course of the 20th century. It evolves in terms of a street food to become one that's eaten in restaurants. And also, it evolves in the way it's served. So typically, if you go to a sushi restaurant today, you order something and you're given two pieces, right? Oh, it's always two pieces. Why two pieces? Well, this dates back to the period maybe during World War II or shortly after World War II, when the sushi sellers, the sushi makers, they didn't have a lot of fish. So there wasn't a lot of variety. So rather than give you one of one thing, they give you two. And also in this period comes the idea that sort of a sushi set is 10 pieces. Where did this come from? Well, it came out right after the war. Right after the war in Japan, all the restaurants are closed. Sushi makers, they want to get back into business, but it's really tough. They don't have ingredients. So the sushi restaurants in Tokyo petitioned the government. I think actually they petitioned MacArthur for this. They petitioned SCAP at the time and asked if they could do a barter system with people. If customers bring a set amount of rice or some other ingredients, then what do they get? They'd get 10 pieces of sushi. So this barter system was proposed. It was allowed, and other people, other sushi makers throughout Japan started doing this as well. So that's where you get this idea that a sushi kind of set is 10 pieces. Moving on now. Well, sushi is global. And wow, has it changed. I mean, if you go to an American supermarket and you look at the sushi there, it's a world apart from the very clean, geometric sushi of the early modern period. As a matter of fact, it's kind of hard to find the sushi sometimes because of all the sauces, all the fried stuff, all what else that's sort of piled on the top. Why is this? Why do Americans and people in other countries too like all these toppings on their sushi? Well, I think it's because at least Americans, they like something more robust, something heartier. A little cucumber roll's not going to cut it. So they want something that's a little heavier, has fat in it, and then it's really savory, or has what we call, what people are using this term all the time nowadays is umami, this savoriness. And the way Americans get that is by loading on the fat, loading on the flavor, and loading on stuff on top of the sushi. It's not a bad thing, but sushi that's sold where I am, there's no information about the nutrition on this sushi. You have to kind of dig for it. And so I went online and I looked at some of the popular sushi that's being sold at Dillon's supermarket and Hy-Vee supermarket. And I was really astounded by how fattening it was and how much sodium it had. And so this slide here compares some popular sushi rolls. And of course, I took some bad examples, right? There are ones that are healthier, but I took some bad examples and I compared them with McDonald's hamburgers and Big Mac. And look, the Hy-Vee crispy California roll has 2,020 milligrams of salt. And that's quite astounding because the American Heart Association says we should only have 2,300 in our daily diets. And maybe people who have heart conditions should eat a lot less. And here's this one roll that has almost your daily value of salt. Look at the calories too. Some of them are have more calories than a hamburger. So the sushi that we pick up at the supermarket, we're not even thinking about it. We think it's healthy, natural, but wow, look at the calories and sodium and saturated fat it has. What I say something about the future of sushi. And of course, have to be careful trying to predict the future, especially as a historian. But I think one direction that sushi might go is people might look again at this ancient fermented sushi. And because there's a big fermentation boom globally now. People are very interested in fermented foods. And it's astounding, that you can take a carp and make it taste like a salami or prosciutto or a summer sausage by fermentation. That's really remarkable. I think if chefs knew this, they do some interesting things with it. Also, putting koji mold into these fermented sushi. Koji, if you're familiar with sake, it's used in sake, it's used in miso, it's used in soy sauce in Japan. It's a mold. And what the purpose of that mold is it breaks down the starches in rice into amylase. The amylase and protease, the enzymes at koji break down starches in rice, releasing all kinds of sugars and releasing umami naturally. So koji is really an amazing mold, and it can really enhance the flavor profile of many different dishes. And in America, 2/3 of the bread that's sold commercially has koji in it. I saw how this all came together in a small restaurant in Shiga Prefecture, a place run by a family of fishermen called Biwako Daughters. Actually, the women of the family run this restaurant, and they offer a funazushi sandwich there that just blew my mind. They took that fermented fish, that fish that had been made with some koji added to it, and the proprietor made a sandwich out of it. She sliced it very thin. She put it on Italian bread. She added some Dutch cheese. She toasted it. Wow. I felt that I was in some Tuscan hill town in Italy enjoying this really amazing sausage sandwich. That blew my mind, but so did desserts, because she took the rice that had been used to ferment the fish and she added it to a little bit of cream and whipped it all together and then used it to fill this really amazing dessert. This is a chocolate melon bread. Usually in Japan, melon bread looks like a muskmelon. Here's a chocolate version of this, filled with this cream that contained the rice used to ferment this fish. It was amazing. It had a kind of citrus note to it, but no citrus. And I just gobbled these things up. So I think, as we think about the future of sushi, we have to really be careful following the same old habit of going after fish that should be listed as endangered species, things like bluefin tuna. And instead, we should use fish that is ubiquitous. Things like carp, fish like carp. And ordinarily, we might think carp, well, I don't want to eat a carp. But if you ferment it this way, it really changes the flavor profile of the carp. So if I'm to offer kind of some idea about what I hope the future of sushi is, that's what it would be. People go back to these ancient methods of fermentation and create something spectacular and new. That's about my 30 minutes. So we can turn now to some questions. I'll be glad to answer them about sushi or about Japanese food in general. And I appreciate your patience listening to me so far.
Thank you so much, Professor Rath, for this awesome presentation. So to begin the question and answer aspect of today, I wanted to begin with asking about, so I read an article maybe last month, and it was talking about how there's an interest now in vegan sushi. And I'm wondering, with regards to vegan sushi, how, well, considering how there's been questions about the sustainability of certain types of fish, like salmon and abalone and things of that nature, do you think vegan sushi will become like the next phase of sushi. You mentioned about perhaps, the future could include fermented sushi, but do you think that's a possibility as well?
Sure, why not? I mean, it's all good. I think if I learned one thing about studying the history of sushi, is that sushi just has constantly changed through the centuries. There's not one point where you can say, this is sushi, because it just keeps evolving. And I think we have to recognize that. There are some people who are purists and say, no, 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 this only this can be sushi. Only this delicacy made by this very expensive restaurant in Tokyo can be sushi. But really, sushi's gone global. People are doing all kinds of things. They're making sushi bagels, sushi pizza, all kind of stuff. So um, I think it's all good, in my view, at least. So vegan sushi, why not? I think one of the things that I want people to take away from my book is that, sushi should be very approachable. It should be something that you can just do yourself. And so my book has recipes in it.
Thank you so much. Also, with regards to fermented sushi, so you mentioned the history of sushi. Sushi began, as fermented, and it's kind of transitioned into now, including, vinegared rice. Do you think that over time sushi has become less nutritious because fermented things are obviously way more nutritious and healthier, but now when you go to like a sushi go around a kaiten sushi, there's other options outside of nigiri sushi, or it also includes some fried things similar to the way it is in the US. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I think I don't think it's very recent that sushi's become a meal, you know. Um, if we go back into the ancient period, people would have sushi, but it would just be like one thing in a banquet, it wouldn't be the main dish. You just have a little bit of that fermented stuff. And even the medieval period, also early modern period, sushi is something you grab and go. It's like a hot dog. So now we get in the post-war period, sushi that's sort of like a meal. So sushi's been constantly changing like that. And I think that's you have to remind me of your question again. I got sidetracked.
Yes, sir. So, what I guess I was trying to ask is, do you feel like sushi has become less nutritious in
Oh,
comparison to?
nutrition. Yeah, I guess I was trying to find a polite way to say that it's really not a nutritious food per se. You know, I mean, it's are the supermarket examples less nutritious? Yes, I would say so. Um, but it really depends. There's such variety of sushi, so I think it's really hard to say if they become less nutritious, except if you point out certain examples like what's available in supermarkets.
I see. Yeah, I guess I was referring to like now that we use like vinegared rice and when you go to like the kaiten sushi, you can find like tempura sushi on things like that. As it seems like, in my opinion, it seems like perhaps even though fermented sushi might be a bit more have a stronger taste than what we typically eat today, perhaps it had way more health benefits, I guess, because it was fermented.
Yeah, I think so. Fermented foods are good for you. I mean, a lot of people advocate for fermented foods. Um, I ate too much of it though. When I was in Shiga, I was studying Funazushi, and I thought, oh, I'm never going to be ever able to eat this again. So I had it almost every meal, which was a really big mistake because my mouth just like tasted like bile at the end of 3 days. Yeah, like vomit. so so it's best in small doses. Um, So it's not just a matter of what you're eating, but the quantity, I think, too.
I see. Very interesting. So going back to what you were saying with regards to fermented sushi, I believe when you mentioned it was a lot of overkill, um, uh, DK asked, what did you mean by that when you said it's overkill to eat fermented
Overkill?
sushi? Yes.
I don't know what I meant by that. I can't recall what I was saying.
I think you were referring to like if you eat too much fermented sushi, kind of what you were just saying. It's a
Yeah,
big
that's just
thing.
what I just was saying. It just is kind of a health warning to people to not to eat too much of it, because that fermented sushi is it's meant as a sort of side dish with sake or something like that. You know, it's not a meal in and of itself. I I was in Shiga just for a very limited amount of time, so I really wanted to make a meal of it every day, and I don't advise anybody to do that. So a little goes a long way.
Thank you so much. Amit Newfield asked, is the fermented carp, are they using the whole fish with the bones or is it fillet?
Right? Yeah, they use the whole fish with the bones, and the lactic acid fermentation makes those bones soft enough to eat. So it's really remarkable. You can eat it from tip to tail.
Uh, so Martin Colling asks, how have the types of fish used for sushi changed over time? When did maguro tuna become so prominent?
Right. Maguro really becomes prominent in the post-war period, late 1950s, 1960s. Um, Before that, you know, before the Second World War, having refrigeration is really a great luxury, you know, even for a restaurant. And traditionally, sushi makers might have ice on hand, um, but they tended to have smaller fish. And bluefin tuna is huge. It's a massive fish. And so being able to like get that and preserve it so that you can make the most of it, it was just too much of a task. So a lot of times bluefin tuna wasn't appreciated at all. You know, the story is that people would feed that to cats, right? But in this after the Second World War, uh, people are more interested in having more fatty, savory foods, steak, um, and bluefin tuna fits the flavor profile very well because it's a very fatty, oily type of fish. So that's when that really takes off. Before the war, people are using smaller fish, more seasonal fish. If you're making sushi in the early 19th century, you're going to be using what's available locally, right? It's only in the post-war period where Japan develops these ocean-going vessels that will flash freeze fish and then send them back to port immediately.
Very interesting. Um, do you imagine perhaps um, if there does become a strain on certain fish, like nowadays, as you mentioned, or as mentioned, tuna is very popular, and there's also various types of salmon that's eaten. Do you do you predict perhaps, I don't know, another fish might become popular in its place if we find that the way that fish is caught or farmed becomes unsustainable, particularly those two fish?
Yeah, I think, you know, this is really falls on us as consumers to do a little research and to have a conversation where with our sushi chef, you know, when we go to a restaurant and tell them that you know, we want something sustainable. How do we know it's sustainable or not? Well, the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a phone app that you can download, and you can look on that, and you can see locally, you know, what's available and what's sustainable, and you can avoid things that are not sustainable. But it's kind of a moral dilemma. If you someone takes you out to a sushi restaurant and you don't have the luxury of choice, and somebody the chef puts down very nice fatty tuna in front of you, do you send it back or do you eat it? That's a difficult kind of question to wrestle with. But as consumers, we can take the initiative here and eat sustainably.
Is there a particular fish that you like in place of like tuna and salmon or recommend?
Yeah, there's a different kind of tuna, not bluefin tuna, but skipjack tuna, which is katsuo in Japanese, which is those lovely flakes that are put on top of everything, and they're the stock for miso soup. But katsuo, that's not an endangered fish. There's plenty of katsuo still. Or at least there was the last time I checked. And katsuo is really filled with great. It's almost like something like a MSG, natural MSG. I think it's isopropylene. Oh well, don't quote me on that, but it's type of flavor enhancer that's naturally in that fish. And so katsuo is just the greatest. I love that. Especially, it's not sushi, but katsuo tataki, where you take some sashimi, just slice the fish, and then they grill it over a rice fire, not rice straw fire. It's amazing. That's my favorite thing to eat in Japan.
Sounds delicious. Now, Professor Rath, would you mind also repeating the website you mentioned about finding what fish are not endangered currently, please?
Right. It's the Monterey, California, Monterey Bay Aquarium. And I think it's a phone app. You can download it for your phone, or you can look online, consult it.
Thank you very much. Jacqueline Mizani asked, in the picture of the funazushi, is the orange element the rice?
Oh, I'm so glad she asked that question, because actually that orange element, that's the roe, that's the fish eggs. You see, when those fish are caught in March, April, that's the fish's spawning season. And that's when fishermen want them, because those fish with eggs are more desirable. They sell more. They sell for more. So they're more expensive. So female funazushi always costs a little bit more than male version. And some people have their preference, but that's what the orange was. It was the fish roe.
Interesting. That was, I figured perhaps that was it, but since that was a fermented sushi, I guess yeah, that was a very good question. All right. So the next question comes from Richard Williams. Could you speak more of the use of koji in U.S. bread and how that came about?
I don't really know the history of that, but it does help the bread to rise. But I was really struck by that fact that commercially it's used in 2/3 of the bread that's sold. And I've used it, or my wife has used it in baking at home, and it really works wonders. It's great stuff. But koji is finding all kinds of uses nowadays. It's used in laundry detergents. It's used in pet foods. People just will take koji and salt and make a kind of topping with that, a condiment with that. There's a kind of koji boom now in the United States.
So is the koji boom, is that similar to like how kombucha like is popular since it kind of, both of those are bacteria in a way?
Yeah, I don't know about kombucha. In the case of koji, I think people were interested in it initially for the fact that it's needed to make sake, because it's important for fermentation. In beer brewing, you malt barley, and by doing that, you are able to release the sugar that's locked in grain. Well, in sake, they use this great mold, koji, to do that. And there wouldn't be any sake without koji. And so people initially, were interested, home brewers in the United States were interested in koji for that reason. And of course, koji has all kinds of other culinary uses in Japan. It's used in sushi. It's used in pickle making, soy sauce, miso, a ton of things. And then folks started experimenting with koji to make charcuterie, also adding it to all kinds of things, using it as to make this beverage called amazake, which very sweet. So you can use that instead of another type of sweetener. So lots of applications for koji. People who are really interested in it should check out. I think it's in March. There's the annual Koji Con, which is online.
Thank you very much. Hugh Huen Tran, sorry if I mispronounced your name, but said sushi has become a global dish and is localized to suit the national culture that it is imported into. In your opinion, why, despite such localization, does sushi still retain the soul of Japan? Because the meaning of sushi, it certainly immediately mentions Japan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess we associate sushi with Japan. Maybe someday we won't, you know? I think we have to realize that we live in a time when Japanese food is not restricted to the Japanese islands. There are amazing chefs working in Europe, working in Peru, working in LA, who are taking Japanese food, traditional Japanese food, and bringing it into new directions. So yeah, it does have this association with Japan, but also we have to remember that where did it come from? China, originally, right? So there is that. I guess that's part of the mythology of sushi. You know, it's one of these things we just associate with Japanese culture, even though a sushi bagel is far removed from what you get in Tokyo.
So DK asked, wasn't sushi just like a street snack that was driven indoors by the occupation, concerns by health and safety concerns?
Yeah, sushi was a street snack. At least the nigiri sushi and the sushi rolls. That's something like a hot dog, you know, like in an American city, you pick up a hot dog. That was sushi. You ate it outside, you ate it standing, and that was what a sushi shop was like. There are sushi restaurants, of course, before the occupation, but in a lot of them, you would stand and eat. The only person who was sitting down was the chef, because traditionally chefs sat to do their work. So you'd stand, you'd eat your sushi, maybe just have one, two pieces with some tea, and then you go. Very kind of a quick thing. Very kind of male environment too, you know, masculine space, eating space. But that starts to change before the Second World War. And then definitely, I think as a result of the occupation, outside sushi vendors disappear and sushi moves indoors entirely. But in a lot of establishments, even in the post-war period, people are standing and eating.
A really quick question, and maybe this sounds a little strange, but I do recall you mentioned in your presentation that sushi used to be the size of a hot dog. Why did
Yeah,
sushi get smaller? Like, why is it now bite-sized for the most part?
cost, I think. I mean, maybe I'm an old man, but I remember the sushi of my high school days being much bigger than when I go to a sushi restaurant today. It's become, you know, very small, and that's just in my lifetime. Um, Part of it also is what I was talking about in the post-war period. Rather than serve the big fish, there was this decision, one big piece of sushi. The decision was made by sushi makers to serve two smaller pieces, and the two smaller pieces weren't the equivalent of one big piece. So that's another way that they were able to economize in the post-war period. You know, they would give people two, but you know, if you kind of put them together, it was never like the old sushi that they used to get. That's inflation, you know, and sushi just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
I see. That's unfortunate. But Susie Natawatoli asked, how do sushi chefs handle fish to avoid or get rid of parasites?
Well, in the United States, all the fish that's served raw as sushi was flash frozen. Everything was frozen. And for a set temperature for a set period of time, it's true in the UK. I think it's also true in Japan. I mean, you can go into provincial areas in Japan and get local sushi, and maybe that hasn't been flash frozen, and that's when you can have some problems. But those are very rare, you know. Parasites are really, really rare. But most of the time, it's freezing that'll just knock them dead. So all that bluefin tuna, we probably all seen pictures of bluefin tuna brought into the fish markets in Japan. They're frozen like logs, right?
So to distribute the sushi, Martin Colling asks, how has like the distribution changed? Was it a household food or something to eat out? Were there street stands at first or restaurants with regards to sushi?
Right, yeah. Back when these new types of sushi emerge, the sushi rolls, the nigiri sushi, those are street foods. And while there are a couple of restaurants selling sushi in the 19th century and selling it for a very expensive price point, most of the time it was something that you bought from a food stand. And then in the 20th century, these stands become more sophisticated, but not by much because you're standing and you're eating in there. And these are very masculine spaces. Women could eat some sushi if they go to department stores in the 1920s. Department stores start selling sushi. And by sushi, I'm talking about those nigiri sushi and maki sushi. Now, there's a whole other world of sushi that's made at home. The scattered sushi, chirashi sushi, where you take rice and you put your favorite ingredients and then you mix it up. That's a very homemade sushi. Likewise, a lot of the fermented sushi was made at home traditionally. So that's something that everybody would eat, you know. So there's actually kind of two sushi worlds. There's that sushi that we typically know of today as sushi that grew out of the food stand culture. That's very masculine space. And then the sushi that's made at home, the scattered sushi, the fermented sushi that families would make themselves.
Browen Davis asked, in New York recently, an Australian opened an Australian sushi restaurant. It was on the receiving end of a great deal of negative feedback. Do you think she committed a sin of cultural appropriation?
I mean, people love to sort of jump on these bandwagons and say, what right do you have to do this sort of thing? I don't know the circumstances here, but I mean, like it or not, sushi is global, right? And sushi came from China. So maybe it started out kind of globally, right? It moved from country to country. So to say that it's something that should be restricted, that only certain people can make it in a certain context, that I totally disagree with. You know, that is that's really disempowering. I want people, you know, if they pick up my book, to see some recipes that you can make in Kansas here by just gathering local ingredients, bamboo shoots and flowers and things like that. So people should be empowered by sushi. They shouldn't let some, you know, sushi dictators tell them what's what. Because historically, sushi's changed throughout the years. There's no point where you can say this is traditional sushi because wham, next day it changes.
I agree. Thank you very much. Amit Newfield asked, was the aesthetic presentation of sushi the way it was done originally or became a tradition when sushi was moved indoors to a restaurant setting?
The statics presentation, I'm not sure I understand what
Aesthetic.
question is. Oh, aesthetic.
Yes.
Um, I don't know. I mean, if you're selling food, you want to make it look good, right? Even if it's a food stand. So I've read some descriptions of early food stands in the 20th century, and although the fish is arranged on ice, like at a market, sounds pretty good. So people are always conscious of visuality in Japanese cuisine. No matter if it's made at home or if it's made for another person or being sold especially. So I think that there's some kind of aesthetic that's at work. You want to make the food look good, and it's just in the post-war period when it moves into restaurants, then it becomes more rarefied. It's more of a kind of elitist type of aesthetic, but I think it's always been there. Even like the sushi that's packed into a bucket to ferment, it's always done very nicely.
Very interesting. Maybe this might be the last question, but Hitomi Tonomura asked, often a restaurant offers the customer a nice tea mug with lots of kanji for fish written on it. How many different kinds of fish are there that can be written in kanji? I also heard that many are not in China. In other words, they are in Japanese kanji. Can you talk about the writing for fish in Japanese?
Yeah, someone asked me this today, and I should have looked up how many fish kanji there were in China, but I didn't. In Japan, there's about 1,000 of them, and 16,000 different words for fish. So 1,000 kanji, if I remember correctly, more than 1,000, and 16,000 different words for fish in that country. Just shows you how important fish are to the diet. Could you fit all 1,000 of them on a mug? I would really like to see that. It would be very, very small, right? Or a big, big mug. Yeah.
That's amazing. But I think that concludes our question and answer portion for today. So thank you once again, Professor Rath, for your presentation today and taking time out of your day to be with us. And thank you once again to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York. And lastly, so much again, Professor Rath, for your time and sharing the wondrous information about sushi with us today. Thank you, everyone who joined us today, and for the awesome questions. I'm so sorry that we couldn't get to all of the questions in the chat, but I do thank everyone for joining us today. And as always, we hope to see you next week. Thank you so much. Take care. See you.
Thank you very much.